Hey guys, wanted to welcome you to the Frequency Co podcast. Today we're with Garrett Hardy. He's a good friend of mine. We've been talking gear for 4 or 5 years. I've always looked up to Garrett's playing and just your approach to things. And so excited to have you today.
Man, honored to be here.
Yeah, it'll be fun, man. It'll be fun. So Garrett, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
All right. So my name's Garrett Hardy, and I've been playing guitar since I was probably acoustic since I was like 12, but electric I kind of picked up around 16, 17.
Okay.
Started running with it. So 34 now. So you do the math on that. But been running with it. So I grew up in a small town called Lumberton, Texas, kind of down by Beaumont, which is east of Houston. And I was like the first electric guitar player in the church, and you know what I mean, that kind of stuff. So there's not much gear or music scene in that area.
Yeah.
But kind of cut my teeth. I mean, that's right when, Hillsong was coming out with United We Stand and stuff like that. So youth groups were wanting to do that. And so, had some friends that played bass and drums and guitar. We just made it work. You know what I mean? Like, did our best impressions of stuff. So that's kind of where I cut my teeth. In 2010, moved up to Dallas to go to Christ for the Nations Bible school. And a friend of mine had already been going and was going to go back to finish. And so he was like, man, it's a Jesus music, whatever school. And it just kind of triggered something in my heart. And I didn't necessarily grow up charismatic or in that environment at all.
Yeah.
But just felt to pull towards it and stayed in Dallas. That's where I met, all my friends today. So Joel, Alyssa, and Yola, Johnny and Joe Awesome, all those guys, we all went to school together at CFNI.
Okay.
And we were part of a ministry called YFN, which was the youth camp. And that's kind of how we all got to know each other. And then we all had secretly hoped that we'd all get to continue doing ministry together after, you know. And we all just one by one kind of landed at Upper Room by happenstance. Some people, had just found it. There was a coffee shop across the street. It's not there anymore, but people would go to that coffee shop, and then some of the people that were at the church worked at that coffee shop.
Okay.
So they'd kind of invite people.
Yeah.
I was working at a church, and like the last thing I wanted to do was go to another church on a Sunday.
Yeah.
But eventually went and just kind of fell in love with Upper Room and, their mission and what they do.
Yeah.
And so at some point we just, our leader, Michael Miller, just felt like, man, we need to just press record on what we do and just see what happens, not for the influence of anything, but just, we really feel like what God's put in our hearts and what we're doing here is biblical. It's the tent of David. It's the latter house of David, as we read in scripture. And so just see if it connects, see what's out there.
Yeah.
And I think the first song we did was a cover of a Mosaic song. I can't remember the name of it. Tremble. That's the name of it. Yeah, there we go. And it just kind of took off. I think people connected with, Abby was singing on that one, who is an incredible worship leader, a great voice. And I think just people connected with the passion and the heart on it.
Yeah.
And what was funny for us was like, everybody's like overnight sensation. It was like, we've just been doing this. Right. And then we decided, let's just turn on a camera and see what happens. You know? So there's more to it than that, but that's a pretty gross overview.
What year did you start going to Upper Room?
So my wife and I started going officially like at the beginning of 2015.
Okay.
But I had been in and out since like late 2013.
Okay.
I would go to prayer sets or something like that. And I didn't grow up in a prayer culture, so I didn't really get it.
Yeah.
And CFNI had a prayer culture, but it was like very IHOP-esque. And I just didn't grow up in that environment, so I didn't get it. They were talking harp and bowl, and I'm like, I don't know what that means. You know what I mean? So I just didn't have a grid. And then when I got to Upper Room, they just were very clear about in scripture where they were getting this idea from. Yeah. And that, I really resonated with that. And so like 2013, Joel and Alyssa, and that's when I met the Gamboas, who did not go to CFNI. They were at Upper Room at that time. Right. And so they had all kind of become friends, and then I kind of came into the friend group with them. And so 2013 would be kind of a start.
And when did y'all start like pressing record?
Man, so there's some really ugly recordings out there from the very beginning. So we used to do a prayer set from like 10 p.m. to midnight on Fridays.
Okay. Cool.
I say they were already doing it. And then I was kind of coming in, like I was already serving at churches. I don't want to play somewhere else. I just kind of want to come receive, from the Lord. And, inevitably it's like, oh, you play guitar, you should bring your stuff. It just happens that way. But I felt the grace of the Lord for it,
Yeah.
Wasn't forcing it or anything. And so, we were doing those, and those prayer sets at the time are very similar to what you see on a Sunday now,
right.
Where occasionally someone might come up on a mic and direct what's happening.
Sure.
But it was very much led by the musicians and the singers.
Wow.
And so it was kind of for Upper Room still modeled a lot of the traditional prayer set styles. So we kind of carved a new path by having, hey, the singers and musicians will simply do all of that at one time without having a designated prayer leader or something. So it was kind of revolutionary for the house and for us.
Yeah.
And so we would set up, we only had like a PreSonus, like 16 channel or something. I don't remember what they were, So, but we only had like 8 mics. Yeah. So it was maybe 2 over the drums for the singers, and then maybe a guitar amp if we had enough,
Yeah.
So some of those, I think we've got them archived somewhere, on somebody's hard drive from ages ago. So I'd like to try to find those and see how bad it sounds. But there was some early, like, what we're doing here, we just feel like we'll bless people. It wasn't to become something or do something, you know what I mean? And it obviously inevitably became that on some level, but I think the start was just, honor the Lord.
Yeah.
And just, we feel like what we're doing here, people would be blessed by. So,
yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
I think too, like, just like the excellence y'all went about it, even like just doing the best you could with what you had. I always remember like I was like starting to learn songs, it would never be like looking up like an Elevation song, or like, I'm not going to look up, like Worthy of It All or something like that by, Elevation or something like that. It was always Elevation or Worthy of It All, Upper Room or something like that. Cause I'm like, what is Garrett playing? What are some of these guys playing that are, different takes or different things like that. So it was always cool to hear that. So like from there, I mean, were you a part of like songwriting, stuff like that, developing parts?
So everything, people say organic a lot, but I really feel like that's what was happening. Like, when I really say we just pressed record on what we were doing, I mean, that's what was happening.
Yeah.
So it's not like, I mean, Julian, who also played guitar for a long time, I mean, he's still at Upper Room, but, we were kind of some of the original guitar players there on electric. We never like sat down and did parts or anything.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was very much just on the fly in the moment.
Yeah.
Which looking back, I'm like, that's really stressful. Like you're producing on the fly in the moment.
Yeah.
And you have no idea where the worship leader is about to go. We don't even know what song we're doing, So it's just a mess all the time, So it just kind of grew organically. So from the beginning, it was a lot of me and Julian working out like, hey, I kind of heard this, I think it's from John Mayer or somebody at some point, but they kind of like at the 7th fret and higher kind of divided like lead and then rhythm kind of 7th fret and lower. It's not a hard, fast rule, but it's like those lower registers aren't going to compete necessarily with the higher ones.
Yeah.
So you could be doing 2 different things at the same time and not clash.
Yeah.
Because that's what 2 different guitar players in a flow environment and they're not communicating. It's just a mess,
Yeah.
Reverb's flying everywhere and nobody can hear anything. And so we eventually just kind of talked about that and worked that out. So we would, you could probably look at old recordings on services where we look at each other and we kind of like, if we're in a moment and we're just creating, so it's not a song, but we're just vibing.
Yeah.
I might run out of an idea at some point because we've been on the moment so long. So I just look at Julian and we say, hey, like flip. And so I'll go low and he'll go high. And so you'll kind of see that.
Sure.
That's probably a pretty good DNA of most of the Upper Room guitars, even now. That's kind of how that works,
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it, because I think you run into that space a lot of like, oh, there's 2 guitar players, who's playing lead, who's playing rhythm, or I mean, with some of the newer songs, there's 7, 8 guitars on a track, and it's like, what do you even do? And because I mean, you guys, you're not necessarily playing with tracks a whole lot. You're not
Right.
playing it like the record, like, so just that free flowing expression is cool. What do you feel like were some of the things that like helped you to like play in those free flowing environments, like
So
techniques, things like that?
yeah, it's a great question and one that I love to answer. I don't necessarily know that everyone could replicate this. I'm
Yeah.
sure you can on some level, but my last year, so I went going to CFNI Bible school. There's 3 years, and so in my third year, I did like the worship track, but that's the year that I tried out for the main like
Okay.
chapel band, basically. And that was Dutch Sheet's first year
Okay.
as like leader of the school. He kind of came in and took over. I say took over, not in a bad way. Like
Yeah.
they invited him in and wanted him to do his thing, But he was very flow, like not a lot of structure.
Yeah.
So his commandment to the worship team that year was, we're not going to practice. You're going to show up at 7:59, plug in, and chapel starts at 8.
Wow.
And that's what we did for a whole year. So, guys like, Jonathan Lewis, who's at Upper Room now,
Yeah.
and I think he's still connected with CFNI, but, he
Right.
was one of the main worship leaders, Gabe Allred, who they're both, incredible singers and musicians in their own right.
Yeah.
They're just off the cuff going.
Yeah.
So it helped. That was so for a whole year, there's no plan. So if we go into a song, I have to remember the part in my head. And now we're playing in a different key and think, how can I play it in that key? That kind
Yeah.
of stuff. Yeah, I'm working all that out on the fly,
Yeah.
So that was the biggest one that really opened my eyes.
Yeah.
Some of the ministries that like YFN, which is a part of CFNI, the Youth for the Nations, we were doing some of that there too.
Sure.
But like by and large, that year on Chapel Band was like
Just
the
free.
one, like we just had to figure it out. you know?
Yeah.
So that was the biggest one that made me feel comfortable in that environment.
Yeah.
So that's where I cut my teeth. So can everyone replicate that? No, but I've always encouraged, like when we travel a little bit with Upper Room and we get to meet other worship teams and have sit downs or like
Yeah.
breakout sessions, one of my strongest encouragement is like most churches are probably still doing a midweek rehearsal.
Right.
So hey, once a month, why don't you guys just for 2 hours or however long your practice is, just flow, just start.
Yeah.
And I even tell people, get super practical, like get a couple chord progressions, like have 5 chord progressions.
Yeah.
And when somebody calls out, like they just hold up, hey, we're going to go with progression 3,
Yeah.
So like, even if you're in the moment, you want to switch to another progression, you have a couple loaded up
Yeah.
and you can just practice flowing
Right.
and just, and I say practice flowing, like you're just worshiping, but the
Right.
band's learning how to do that on the
Yeah.
fly, So if that's like a core part of a ministry or a church you're at where they want to do that, you can't beat the practice of it.
Right.
It's like you just have to do it. You
Yeah.
have to put in reps. People have asked, well, like you and Julian just kind of developed a sound, or like you guys know how to play together in a unique way. Well, man, I have, 7 years of reps,
Yeah.
like 3 times a week.
Yeah. That's
You can't replace that,
No.
So that I think that kind of answers your question.
Yeah. I think unfortunately, I think sometimes it has to be trial by fire of
Yeah.
like, this is kind of like, because I'm in a similar environment where you're playing just tons of flow stuff. And it's like, you kind of have your staples, you have like your stuff you kind of always go to, but like, it's also fun just to try new things, get a little risky. And
You're going to have some blunders,
yeah,
but it takes those to get to the magic,
Yeah.
And so that's what we just, at some point you could think it would be, man, it's a little nerve wracking thinking every time I play the red light's on,
yeah,
but you kind of learn to live with it.
Yeah.
And, if you're brave enough, you go back and listen to live streams and see how
Get
you
humbled.
did. It's an acquired taste. I can't say that I do it all the time, but there are times when if I did like something or I was interested to see how something worked, I would go back and listen
yeah,
and take from that. And live stream is a different than in the room. Like
Sure.
it's not 1-to-1 all the time, but it's pretty close.
Yeah.
Especially nowadays.
What was like some of your like, what was like some of your biggest guitar inspirations in like helping in flow or like writing parts, things like that?
Man, when I was young, like first getting into electric guitar, I used to be scared of writing parts because I
Okay.
thought, what if I write parts that are terrible? Or, you know, what if I don't have it in me? You
Yeah.
know, so I kind of avoided it for so long. Like I
Yeah.
got really good at just being in a worship band and learning other people's songs, but like when it came to writing, I was like, man, what if my parts stink or whatever? But I eventually had to get over that. But a lot of what I have listened to is stuff that inspires me.
Yeah.
So for me, like I kind of in my brain, I can decide when I want to just listen to music,
Yeah.
which is nice. But by and large, I listen to music to pull guitar tones. I listen to a lot of guitar centric music,
Yeah.
So a lot of for me early influences would be, and I don't know if my brother will ever watch this, but he's like a huge reason. This is like LimeWire,
Yeah.
like melt the family computer because he downloaded all this stuff he shouldn't on
Yeah.
it. But like that was my intro to music and some of the CDs I'd bought over time. But he showed me a bunch of stuff. He was listening to like, that's back when Christian music was like the most popular thing at the time. You know what I mean? Like it was even beating, worldly music at the time.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's where I heard some of that stuff. He also listened to like a lot of funk, like Grandmaster Flash, Furious 5, which like, do I regularly listen to that? No, but like it's in there somewhere. You'll hear that influence at some point, you know? So he listened to all kinds of stuff. He was listening to rock. He was listening to, that's when emo was first starting to like hit like acoustic emo. So there's just like all these things bounce around. But the main, if it has to come to guitar players, like Keith Urban,
Yes.
I wouldn't like Jimmy Page, who's a legend, you know what I mean? But like his guitar tone's not necessarily what I gravitated towards, but what he could play.
Yeah.
Sometimes was like something for me. Obviously the Edge, I mean, you can't get away from that.
Sure.
The guy is magic. I know he gets a lot of hate, but for me, I'm like, I very much am inspired by the Edge because he plays exactly what needs to be in the song. And to me, if you're in a group, if it's not your thing, your EP or your album, it's a collaborative event. Like,
sure,
you need to just fill what makes the most sense. You know? That's something I've always liked about the Edge and something I've taken from him. You know? But for me, I think like probably top is Keith Urban because he can do so much. Like, yes, it's country, but he can rock. He's got a couple songs where he's kind of on a strat and it's very soulful, sultry, and it's like, man, he just can do it all,
Yeah.
And then obviously, John Mayer, you can't get away from that. Continuum was like 2006, I think. I mean, I'm in high school.
Right.
And, I probably wore that CD, the physical CD out, you know? Because there was some guitar tones he was getting that you just, how is he doing? It's glassy, but like full. And then, that's when the gear thing was taking off, like 2008, 2010. All these companies started emerging, Strymon, all these guys are kind of popping up out of nowhere, seemingly, So for me, like Keith Urban's one of my top. There's some lesser known guys that I've really started to pull from. Like I think of Matt Kidd, who's a Houston guitar player. He does less guitar now, but he was in Robbie C band for a long time. And he's just was all over the Houston scene for worship stuff. So growing up in Texas, there was kind of like a Texas worship scene when I was a teenager, and he was very much part of that. I think of guys like Nathan, I think it's Duggard. But he plays for Drew Holcomb and the Neighbors. Just very inspiring. It's a very Americana singer-songwriter. But it's like he can rock, he can be quiet, he can just do it all. You know what I mean? And I'm just very inspired by that. So those are, I kind of float between those. I think like if I had to do the triangle, it's like Jimmy Page, Keith Urban, and U2. And I'm always, the Edge. I'm trying to take those three things and make it me. Like, you know what I mean? Trying to pull those 3 points together at all time,
Well, and Keith, like, I'm very similar. Like Keith is probably one of my favorite guitar players, and he's like so melodic with his writing, and like the bends, the tone, the guitar, like everything that he does. I'm just like, I don't know if there's anyone
like a
else.
Vocal. Like, you know what I mean? That's how he does it. It's not like a guitar. I mean, it is guitar, but it's like the melodic part of it. It's just magic, man. I don't know how he does it. You know?
The Golden Road album was probably one of my favorites. Like, I don't think there's a bad song on that album. And then as much as I hate to admit it, the Highway Don't Care track with Taylor Swift and and Tim McGraw,
Yeah.
like just that guitar part, and then the solo on that's nuts. Like
Yeah.
he's just very, very melodic with his playing. I also like because I'm pretty sure he's running like a lot more like British style amps, lots of clean or lots of headroom,
Yeah.
breakup. Like it's cool the way he's doing it. Like I remember like watching him and like Brad Paisley's like premiere guitar videos of like
Yes.
their rig rundown and stuff, and it's just cool what they're doing. I think
Yeah.
it's really unique, especially in the country scene. That's really cool.
Let me say one thing on that.
Yeah,
This is important to me. I just had a conversation about this earlier today. So growing up, I don't know if it was just because it was like in the church worship world or whatever, but everybody everybody universally was like avoid Marshalls.
yeah,
I don't know why, but that was the case.
yeah,
So for years, I just never even touched one. Well, like Keith Urban is telly into a Marshall,
yeah,
probably a JTM or a Super Lead or something.
yeah,
But I mean, like it's like the tone I've been chasing. I've been trying to make a Fender have the high mids of the
yeah.
Marshall, and it's not working.
Right.
So like, when I finally found like a Marshall I could plug into that was good, not like a JCM 800. I'm sure it's fine. It's just not my style. It was like, oh, I get it now. I
Yeah.
understand how he was getting some of that stuff.
Yeah.
So it's like it was that for me.
Yeah.
And even if it didn't even have to be super lead, like the 18-watt Marshalls, I
Right.
love those things. But
Right.
there's like a sticky mid range to it that just
Yeah.
works. And
It's-
I wish I'd have known that younger.
Yeah.
It would have saved me a lot of amps. You know what I mean?
I think it's like one of those things, like I'm probably one of the biggest like Dr. Z fans.
Yep.
Like the Z-Rec is great. I think like the Maz amp is fantastic. Like
Incredible.
we've got one at our church. We have like the Maz Senior, and we've had it for like 5 years. I mean, it's probably gotten hundreds of play hours on it.
Yeah.
And I think we've retubed it once.
Yeah.
And it's just like, just all the different tones you can get out of it. I mean, you can like get the real like muted, like mid-range thing if you want. You can set it where it's really cutting a lot. But I think what a lot of times, like with the Marshall tone, everybody's like really intimidated by like a massive, 50-watt, 100-watt head.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, what do I do with this? But I think some of those like Dr. Z amps, like the Marshall Blues Breaker amp circuits, stuff like that, you can get that edge of breakup, kind of punchy tone. And I think it's like one of those things, like you can't replicate it with any other amp.
Yeah.
It's really, really hard to get that really nice, crisp kind of Marshall tone. I think with that, like what are, with some of that Marshall inspired, Keith Urban inspired stuff, like what's like your staple pieces, whether it's amps, guitars,
Yeah.
pedals, like what's your staples?
So I don't know if it's hanging up or we put it somewhere, but my yellow guitar is here. We'll probably show it at some point.
Yeah.
But it's been a main guitar I got that in 2010. So 15 years now.
Yeah.
It has been my main number one guitar.
Yeah.
It's obviously got the wear to show that.
Right.
know? But like that, it didn't necessarily have to be that telly. I mean, I'm just drawn towards telly. I like the snap.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily want to go into the country vein, but like I like how just responsive the low end can be, what I
Yeah.
mean, without washing out and getting kind of rumbly. So specifically that telly, I've had a Keeley compressor from the very beginning. I think I watched some video with, I forget his name right now. He's obviously an incredible guitar player, but the guy from the Heartbreakers, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers,
Okay.
Mike Campbell. There we go. I watched some rig rundown in like 2008. So it's in like 244, you know what I mean? Like the worst quality ever. But he was talking about, somebody told me to just throw a compressor on it. It was going to sound good. So I thought, okay. And then a guy I looked up to at the time who was kind of in a traveling worship band, he had one and it always sounded great. So I was like, I got some money for books to go to school. When you graduate and I don't know if it's still a thing, but like you would mail family and friends and they'd send some money to help you buy books and stuff. Well, like I wasn't going to school.
Yeah.
But they were like, well, just send a card anyways. And so I ended up getting, I don't know, maybe $1,000 a little more or something that, which was incredible. But I was like, told my mom, I'm like, I had not planned to go to school or anything at that time, So I was like, what if I want to do music, what if I just got some pedals with this? And
Yeah.
so they were okay with it. And so the first run was Keeley compressor, Nova delay,
Okay.
and maybe a couple of Boss overdrives or something,
Yeah.
because that's what was around. So, but all that to say that Keeley is still a staple to this day for me.
Yeah.
So Telly, Keeley compressor, and then at this point, probably my Frenza lamp,
Okay.
which is kind of a Marshall. It's a mix between a Marshall and a Tweed Deluxe.
Okay.
So they kind of share a similar mid-range.
Sure.
But it stays tight like a Marshall and gets loud, but I like that. So
Yeah.
those are probably those three, and maybe my Timeline, because I've just spent so much time.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of the originals, and I have probably 20 patches I've made over the years in it,
Right.
which are for sale. You can check my Instagram for that.
Where is it at? Is it Sound Shop?
It's on, if you go to my Instagram, there's a
Okay.
link for it, but it's with, Sound Shop Co.
Okay.
Is that their name? Sound Shop Co.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So buddy Daniel runs that.
Yeah.
And so he talked me into selling some presets, and it's been cool.
That's very cool.
So I've kind of hoped to build a community with guys that have bought it, but I just hadn't been able to create it yet. Like I
Yeah.
kind of reached out to them, but either they're not interested or it's not right time. I don't know.
Yeah.
But just so they could feedback to me what they would do different or change.
Sure.
Or, you know what I mean? I want to make it a viable product for people. So.
Yeah. That's very cool. So I think too, like what is like, I think pulling from like the compressor, the Timeline, things like that. I mean, those have been staples on your board. I know we talked, it was probably like 3 years ago, and we were just kind of talking through your board, and I was like, what's the deal with the Flint? And it's
I guess the Flint should probably be on there, but like I could live without reverb. You know what I
That's
mean?
fair.
Like I usually run the delay in a way that kind of semi does that.
Well, I think it's funny because it's like, most people now have to have a Big Sky on their board, or like the Numeris reverb, or like, something like that. But have you ever had a Big Sky?
I've never owned a Big Sky.
Never had a Big Sky.
I'm not, I never like avoided it, but I had a good friend of mine, Eric Smith, who will probably watch this. I say he gave it to me. I traded him an RV5 for a Flint.
Okay.
So he basically gave it to me because those things, you can get an RV5 for $50, you know what I mean? So he was kind enough to do that. And I still have that very Flint to this day on my board. Something about, it's just the 70s plate setting that connected.
Yeah.
Because I had played reverbs, like the RV5, the modulate settings, money, right?
Right.
But all the other settings weren't very good, in my opinion. And Hall to me always washed out, or Spring was too like springy. I wasn't trying to do that sound, surfer sound or anything. So I was like, I just want something that sits well kind of underneath what I'm doing. So it's not super evident that reverb's on, but it just elongates what's happening.
Yeah.
And I feel like the Flint did that really well.
Yeah.
And specifically the 70 setting. I actually, when we traded, I really wanted the tremolo because Nate Duggar, who I mentioned earlier, that's what, when he tracked, he had, old Fender amps that had tremolo.
Right.
So that's what he was getting on his recordings. But when he played live, it sounded the same. Like he was incredible, And so he was like, yeah, I'm using the Flint. I messaged him on Instagram or something one day. He said, yeah, I'm using the Flint for that. Like, well, I have to get the Flint,
Right.
So I bought it for the tremolo, which is great. And then I like turned on the reverb one day on the 70 setting, was like, oh, okay, there's some magic here that nobody's mentioned,
Yeah.
So it just kind of stuck.
Yeah.
I think Strymon did really well by having the favorite setting at the time on those.
Right.
So it was like having two reverbs in one.
Yeah.
And I thought for worship, God, that's great. I don't really need more than that,
Yeah.
If I do, I can bend down and change a setting, So the Flint, probably should be on the staple now that we mention it, but it's magic to me. I'm sure guitar players are going to watch this that have Big Skies. Nothing wrong with it, but the amount of times somebody that I know previously owned a Flint, sold it to go to the Big Sky, and then went back to the Flint. It's innumerable,
Or like if you look at pro boards, there's a reason why there's always a Big Sky and a Flint. Like there's like several like big guitar players, and you look at their board and it's like, why do they have the Big Sky and the Flint, and why do they have the L cap and the Timeline? And it's like those two pedals do stuff that neither one of the other pedals can do.
It's kind of like, the Timeline is probably all the small pedals in one, in theory, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just covering a lot of ground pretty well, in my opinion, And the L cap is just a deep dive on that, tape delay setting from the timeline in a way, And so they get to put a little more DSP power just into that. And so it just, obviously that's a staple on many people's boards.
Yeah.
I've had an L cap for many years. I don't know why I sold it, but I did. And I'll probably get one again. I really want to try the Brigadier. That's one I never tried.
Okay.
Like the old one, the original. Not that I don't like the new one, but I like having the tap on board.
Yeah.
That's kind of a deal breaker for me. So everyone that I know that used to have one of those was like, loved them.
Yeah.
They're like, it truly is a memory man without all the power and issues and stuff like that, So I'll probably get one of those if I can find one. It's hard to even find them online nowadays, but
they're like, I've got friends that have them, and I think one of my buddies, his is like starting to give him issues now, and he's like heartbroken over it. I'm like, it seems like that and the L cap are like almost irreplaceable.
Yeah.
In that sense. But
so it's like having those is like, to me, the L cap for me was like a secondary delay, but it was always on.
Yeah.
And so I basically kept it in quarter note, running with the timeline probably on a dotted eighth.
Okay.
So kind of running in series that way.
Yeah.
Which is something I really stole from, I can't think of his, I just have had trouble with names today for whatever reason, but there's a guy that plays for Phil Wickham named Taylor.
Okay.
I forget his last name, but he's actually a Dallas local guy.
Okay.
Incredible guitar player. He was actually, I know of him from a very early Robbie C band.
Okay.
He used to play for, I think he was in Houston or something at the time. Anyways, that's where Robbie was based out of. But Taylor did all the early guitar work for him.
Sure.
And it was very like ethereal U2, but like great rock, And so, anyways, he was a big L cap guy.
Okay.
And so I kind of gleaned from that too. You know what I mean? He always had great tone.
Right.
He'd probably be on that list of my, inspirations as well.
Sure.
So, but he was L cap Flint.
Okay.
And so there's a couple times where a friend of mine was, I think better friends with, I don't know him directly, but I had a friend that was close with him. And so every time he'd come into Dallas and didn't have his full board, he would use his board.
Yeah.
Specifically because I had those things.
Gotcha.
So, but anyways, they just kind of deep dive. You get a little more control out of the tape part and, the reverbs and stuff from the Flint. So
I think too, like one part of your playing that I really admire is your slide tone and how like it's so clean, consistent. And so like what's your thoughts on like setting up slide tone? Like how is your wet effects? How is your compression playing into that? Because I feel like that's every time I listen to your tone, it's always like the compression standing out to me. And then, the wet effects that they're not overwhelming and getting out of hand, but it's like, I mean, it feels perfect every time I hear you play.
Thank you for that. I work hard for that. Here's my thing. This is kind of a running rule of thumb that I've developed and have shared with people that have asked, but the more like if I'm going to run the compressor louder or more prominent, typically for slide, I will bump up the compression a little bit.
Gotcha.
Which is kind of a standard. I mean, slide players do that, like actual steel, pedal steel, that's what they're doing. The more you run one effect, you're kind of running less of the other effects.
Okay.
So if I'm going to run the compressor a little more, I'm going to run my delay and reverb less.
Okay.
Because what happens is typically a louder, more full signal is going to hit that stuff and make it want to be louder naturally, because it's trying to reverb or delay what it's hearing.
Sure.
And that can start to wash out very quickly.
Okay.
So you typically tuck back on those. So like if I'm loud, this goes across the board. If I'm loud on an overdrive, I'm less on my wet effects.
Okay.
And then vice versa. If I'm a little quieter or cleaner, you can bring the wet effects in more. So
Sure.
It's that push and pull between those.
Yeah.
But typically for the slide stuff, I mean, I just run, yes, it's a compressor pedal, but the way that I've run it for many, many years is like a preamp pedal.
Sure.
And to me, the best preamps have some level of compression anyways.
Yeah.
So in my head, I don't think compression, I think preamp,
Yeah.
But inevitably it is a compressor pedal. It's going to have some of that in there.
Yeah.
Well, I used to run, basically there's a input gain.
Yeah.
And I would pretty much run that maxed out.
Oh, wow.
So it was hitting the compressor and making it basically distort in a way.
Yeah.
and it kind of tightened up the low end and made things
Yeah.
sound great. All that to say, it would be like if you took your compressor and put a boost in front of it.
Okay.
It's going to be very compressed on some level.
Yeah.
So naturally, I could go right into slide tone without making very many changes, you know,
Sure.
because it's already pretty compressed.
Yeah.
So that theory still holds. I don't usually make a ton of adjustments, but if I'll bump up the compression on my Keeley a little bit if it's like, oh, it's not quite.
Yeah.
Some guitars like my Telly,
Yeah.
great for slide. My Reverend less so. It just doesn't quite sing as well with
Sure.
it, you know. It doesn't hold the note as long.
Well, I think it's interesting because a lot of what I hear a lot, you know, whether I'm doing pedalboard consults or talking with other guitar players, is they want their compressor to not color their tone, or they don't want that preamp kind of warm
Yeah.
feel. And I just moved over to the warm pedal 76, which is kind of their 1176, you know, rack mount in a pedal platform. And I am like slamming that thing with compression because
Yeah.
I want that warm kind of saturation
Yes.
from it. So is that similar to kind of what you're doing with the Keeley? Is
It's
you're
pretty
kind of
much
slamming
exactly that. I mean, you know, the Keeley is a Roth circuit, and the Roth circuit's a dumbed down, to my understanding from pedal makers, is a dumbed down LA2A anyways.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, you know, they're cousins.
Yeah.
You know, so I've always liked that warmth in the low end when you bring the compression up.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily want all that compression. So I've found ways to run boosts into it, but cut out the attack and stuff like that. So it doesn't just get like
Yeah.
overwhelming, you know? So
Yeah.
I've had to engineer it in a way to make it work for me.
Yeah.
But I've always liked that warmth because like you barely play and it just blooms and
Yeah.
floats, and that's kind of part of my sound. You know,
Yeah.
it's hard to get away from that.
Are you pushing your attack in quite a bit?
So
And
the
like,
attack is, at least on the Keeley, all the way to the right basically means it's letting transients through and it's slower to grab.
okay.
So slower attack.
Okay.
The way now, because I basically run a preamp into it
Okay.
as kind of, if both pedals were combined, it would be my preamp sound,
Okay.
you know? So it's, I recently got it, but I've really enjoyed it. It's the Catalan bred Epoch Bias,
Okay.
but it basically is the EP3 circuit
Okay.
with some more controls on it. And you can actually change the bias so you can do it a little colder.
Okay.
Like for my Telly, because it's so loud and can really just start distorting, I'll actually run the bias a little colder,
Okay.
and it kind of levels out that.
Sure.
And then when I run my Reverend, which needs a little more gain on
A
it,
little more lift.
I can just run that bias hotter, and it kind of does the thing. You
Yeah.
know? So basically running that Epoch bias slammed into the compressor, but I have that input gain all the way off, and the attack is basically all the way open. So it's just
Gotcha.
letting transients through before it grabs. So it's like a preamp at that point.
Yeah. Very cool. Because are you running like your drives after compression?
Yes. So everything is, you know, preamp compression first, and then it goes to drives and then wet effects at that
Yeah.
point.
Okay.
It's a very simple version of it.
That's very cool. That's very cool. So I know like recently you are kind of running a different take on like the whole direct amp rig. So like everybody's running Tonex, which is great.
Yeah.
Iridiums, ACS1.
Sure.
I know there's a lot of guys that are still running the Dream and Ruby, or not. I shouldn't say still. Dream and Ruby's not that old, but
Right.
that was kind of the thing. What are you running for your direct rig?
Yeah. So we probably need to do a more professional video at some point, but I have one on my Instagram where I just kind of quickly show it off, you know.
Sure.
But my thought was, you know, nowadays a lot of guys have amp heads that they run into either the aux box or Two Notes Audio has a version of one.
Right.
And that concept to me was interesting because it's like, man, you're still getting all the tubes that you like to run through, but it's noiseless. You're just essentially modeling the cabinet. So I thought, well, you know, I don't have to run a whole head because the head has a power amp in it to
Right.
power a speaker. Well, we're not powering a speaker. So my thought was if I could get a tube pre and
Yeah.
run it into, at that time, the aux stomp, which is the same technology for the most part for the aux box, had just come out.
Okay.
So I was like, man, I'll just buy one and see how it feels. And it's pretty incredible. Like it kind
Okay.
of blew me away. So my Frenzel has a line out
Okay.
where you could not have a speaker and it still carries the load basically.
Okay.
I ran that directly into the aux box
Okay.
and did like just a simple little test. And it really, I was like, man, this is exactly how it would sound mic'd up. This is crazy,
Yeah.
So my thought was, if I get like a stereo tube pre and run it into the aux box, it's an amp,
Yeah.
like, and as good as the modeling software is,
Right.
I don't need a power amp, like,
Right.
because it's kind of doing all that,
Sure.
So I have that little rig that I built where it's basically a stereo tube pre, runs right into the aux box and then right into a direct box, and I just 2 XLRs to the house, stereo rig
Super simple.
with tubes. So I still, the overdrives hit it right, and
Yeah.
to be fair to all, the Tonex and everybody else, those style users, I haven't used those.
Yeah.
So I have no opinion on them.
Yeah.
I only have the Walrus ACS1, which to me sounds great.
Yeah.
It just didn't have that push and pull that I was getting,
Yeah.
from real tubes. And I don't know if any of those can do that. So
Yeah.
that's just the only one I've had where it did as well as it can for a 9-volt pedal. You know what I mean? It's actually, I've used it many a times on recordings and have preferred that over some of my amp tones.
Oh,
You know what I
wow.
mean? So it's like, it has its place,
Yeah.
So it just, you start slamming it with overdrives, and I mean, I don't know if any of them can kind of handle that. But for me,
Yeah.
it was like, I just kind of cut all that out at one time and not have to go through modelers and try them all.
Yeah.
I know this will work. And for the large part, like, it has,
How does it respond to wet effects? Because I think one thing I've found running direct is I'm having to like really crank my wet effects.
I actually find just the way that I run my rig, I think because my preamp, compression section is so loud,
Yeah.
hitting everything else, I actually have to back wet effects off in a direct
Okay.
situation. And maybe that's just because the way I run my stuff.
Sure.
But for me, I'm actually, some of my presets, I'm like, wow, I have to run them less than I would in an amp, because the amp is a little more forgiving, because it's tubes and it's a modeler, but it's not all the way there, but it's the happiest I've been in a direct situation.
Well, like I think one of the hardest things to do is like replicate speaker compression and what like an actual speaker's doing, moving air, things like that. It does feel like the aux stomp is gotten, I would say, the closest to that out of anything that I've heard. Just a little bit that I've messed with that pedal, I've been really impressed with it. And I think it's cool that they took, I mean, like a normal aux box is $1,200 used or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're running 2 amps, so you're gonna have to have a cart to lug both your amp heads in.
Yeah.
It's
still all the work, but no speaker at that point. And you're like, well, it's not really even worth it at that point, because that's the fun of the, carrying amps.
No, that's very cool. I love that approach. And I love that, just thinking outside of the box with that, especially if you're able to get, I wouldn't necessarily say the same, but similar tone from your Frenzel amp.
Yeah.
And then being able to get that in a pre
into
the aux is really cool.
So something I didn't share is the Stereo 2 pre that I got is a Frenzel product, which not a lot of people know Frenzel, but he's I think he used to be a pastor, still is, something like that, in East Texas.
Okay.
And he just makes, it's really great quality at an affordable price. I mean, you get a hand-wired head at $1,500 or less.
Wow.
You can't beat that. You know what I mean? So that's why I was originally, I think when I bought them, they were $800, like brand new hand-wired. So I basically just told them, hey, for my Stereo 2 pre, I want you to take the preamp from my specific amp and just put them on both sides.
That's cool.
And I'll just run at that, and, so.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome, Garrett. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show and
it's been fun
talking and hanging out in the shop. Definitely go follow Garrett. Go buy his presets. He's got a ton of really, really helpful content on his Instagram, whether it's delays. One thing we didn't really get into, but he's really broken down like the Morningstar products into like a really like sample size, like very, very easy to grasp kind of the idea of what you're doing with some of the MIDI stuff. So yeah, go follow Garrett.
Thank you.
Go back and watch some of the OG Upper Room videos.
Probably need to update some of them better quality, but they exist. And hopefully they're helpful.
Go get schooled on tone. But awesome. Thanks for watching this video and podcast. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube, follow us on Instagram and Facebook, so that way you can stay up to date whenever we release more videos like this.